Okay, we're ready to start with the session, Local Strategies for the Caribbean, Convergence of Ideas and Ideals, which is going to be led by the Arthur Lockjack School of Business. So without further ado, Professor Miguel Carrillo, this is your panel and these are your presenters and discussants. Everyone, can we please take our seats, at least in the main hall room here? Can we take our seats, please? Okay, Miguel.
Good morning. Hello. Hello. Good morning. Hello. Good morning. Hello. Morning. Hello. Hello. Good morning. Good morning. Buenos dias. Bonjour. Bom dia. We're very happy to be here. We're honored by the opportunity that all the organizers have given to the Lockjack School of Business of the University of West Indies to basically tackle this very important topic, which is the role of the private sector in the future and the development of the Caribbean. What we have today is a more than stellar, I will say, panel of experts, which everybody share a common thread, common denominator. They all are convergence. They have actually worked in their own role, trying to bring together institutions and try to basically have a regional impact. I would like to start by presenting my panelist, His Excellency, Mr. Albert Ramden, which is the Assistant Secretary General of Organizations of the American States. Sir, welcome. It's an honor to have you here, sir. Dr. Inder Rupra, Regional Economic Advisor of the Inter-American Development Bank. Dr. Rupra, thank you for being here. A special welcome as well to Dr. Didicus Jules, a very great friend of the Lockjack School of Business for many years, and now Director General of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. Mr. Richard Lewis, the person who's the chairman of the Council for Competitiveness Innovation, Minister of Planning and Sustainable Development, an entrepreneur and a business leader, Trinidad and Tobago and the region. And Mr. Ian Chinapu, who is the Executive Director of Unit Trust Corporation of Trinidad and Tobago, and one of the the youngest and most interesting CEOs of the Caribbean. He will actually blush after I say that, I know. And welcome. What we try to do here today is to tackle a couple of questions related to the Caribbean. And as well, we have a very important person who actually have provided an amazing vision towards the internationalization of Trinidad and Tobago and the finance sector. Through his role as CEO of Republic Bank, David Dulal-Whiteway has been able to basically conquer literally new worlds as far away as Ghana in Africa. So David Dulal-Whiteway, thank you very much, sir, for being here. It's an honor to have you in the panel. Do we have a regional strategy? I think that every company might say that they have a strategy. But then it's not enough to have a strategy as a company. We have as well to have a strategy as a sector, to have a strategy as well as a cluster, to have a strategy as a nation, and to have a strategy as a region. And this is basically what we're going to talk about, in what ways we can actually align all these strategies together towards a common cause. You give me about 90 seconds. Let me share with you some of the most important results of a session that we have with about 40 CEOs of the region related to different topics related to competitiveness and convergence. And I would just like to basically mention three aspects of this very interesting consultation that we have. Three major concerns that the private sector have and raised in that session, which was actually facilitated by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, is the asynchrony, the lack of link between the economic development with social progress. You know, the private sector basically is very concerned about economic growth being linked to social progress and how, you know, a business can have a bigger and better social impact. The absence of private-public partnerships, not necessarily in the region, but especially in Trinidad and Tobago, and the lack of convergence between the Caribbean and Latin America. So those are the three major concerns that were actually raised in that session. In terms of the top three challenges that actually the national environment of especially Trinidad and Tobago has in terms of improving the national business environment, the top three are A, cooperation in labor employee relations and the link between pay and productivity. That's the challenge number one that was raised. Actually, the challenge number two was law enforcement and security. No surprise. And the third, which is interesting, the quality of port infrastructure and logistics. Very interesting. When we ask the private sector, the captains of the industry, you know, what kind of new investments your company has to make in the future so we can actually help them to drive growth, not only locally but regionally. These were actually the four major investments that the private sector identified. First of all, to invest more in developing and creating international joint ventures. Basically, either to conquer new value chain steps in other regions, or to basically diversify to unrelated business in other regions, or here as well locally, or to access new channels of distribution of products. One of the interesting things that the private sector recognized in that particular session was the lack of the culture of creation of inter-organizational collaborations, especially in the Caribbean, with other businesses abroad. In other words, we prefer to take over than to collaborate, which is quite interesting. The other investments that they identified that will help them to drive growth is to invest in developing a world-class infrastructure in partnership with the public sector. And the third was basically innovation, both in terms of products, markets, and social innovation. Those are the three types of investments that the private sector identify that will help them to drive growth. And one of the most interesting things, and you know, that we talk about in that session was, okay, so we talk about diversification, which is something that's kind of a favorite topic in terms of economic growth. But then we asked a very simple question, you know, what will be the top three clusters where we should focus our attention, not only in Trinidad and Tobago, but in the region? Not the sectors, but the clusters. And there was an overwhelming majority in terms of vision in the private sector. In these, there were about 6 tables. What it was found by the CEOs was that we need basically to develop, first of all, a platform of competitiveness. What this means is basically that in the Caribbean, we have to develop, you know, in a similar fashion, a cluster of energy, the cluster of logistics, and the cluster of agriculture, both with the same emphasis at the same time. Energy, because basically that's the blood that drives competitiveness. Very difficult for a country to compete based on high energy prices. That's critical, especially energy efficiency. Logistics, well, one of the things that you can tell is that if you go and take a look at the top 5 most competitive countries in the world, you will find that each one of them, in its own way, is an actual logistics pole for the world. So logistics is extremely important, and it will actually help us to connect even better to all the other regions. And something that was especially mentioned was agriculture. And the reason why it was mentioned agriculture is because it is a great tool for social development. 1% of growth in the economy based on agriculture actually has a better effect in creating jobs and combating poverty than, for instance, manufacturing or energy. So there was an overwhelming agreement that energy, logistics, and agriculture as a regional cluster must be actually taken into consideration as priorities. And after that, the tourism entertainment cluster, and then the manufacturing cluster as well. A very important, and this is the final introduction to the panel, a very important development was mentioned. It was discussed there that now economic growth in the world is actually been driven by global trade. Global trade is one of the most important growth drivers in the world, along with, obviously, technology. But now more and more, this basically model of trading goods is actually creating and exhausting the possibilities for expansion. Less and less China is exporting manufacturing goods. It's actually slowing down. And exporting stuff is actually now being replaced by the exporting of services. More and more, the global economy is being driven by services more than goods. So one of the most interesting challenges and action items that were identified is how can we develop the Caribbean as a location for services and to export services and global trade of services. So this is basically, in a nutshell, the content. And I will, at this point, ask His Excellency Albert Ramdin to share, briefly his perspective, especially in terms of the private sector partnerships, which was actually a very important topic that was raised by the CEOs. What's going on there? What's happening with PPPs? Is this some sort of real? Is it an illusionary? Or is it really an utopia for the Caribbean? Sir, what's your perspective?
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yes? Great. Well, let me start by thanking Minister Dukaran for this wonderful, important, and very relevant discussion which is taking place. This morning's discussions have already ignited some very strong discussions. The only thing I can hope, Minister Dukaran, is that your efforts will not be in vain. That means that I hope we don't come back in 5 or 6 years and talk about the same again. Because I think the way I look at it is talk is good, but it's better to act, and it's even better to achieve. So I hope that the next time we meet, or others meet, the young population, which will be then in leadership roles, will have a different vision in terms of how the region develops. Because that is what we have to look at towards the future. And I take history as a given, but also as a lesson. But at some point, we have to be pragmatic and practical in terms of how we move this region forward. And with regard to this, the question raised by Professor Carrillo, it is clear, and this is much more from the hemispheric perspective, and this is a lesson learned by many already. Governments alone cannot bring social and economic goods to the people successfully. They cannot be held accountable for peace, prosperity in our countries. They have to work with other stakeholders. The private sector is a key one, civil society, of course, and trade unions as well. So what we need is to get rid of this mistrust between governments and the private sector. That's the first thing. There is too much an environment of